Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Well, Mama don't allow no modern houses going on. Mama don't allow no modern houses going on. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna love my modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no modern houses going on.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio. Join George Smart and Frank King as they talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Support the show by going to patreon.com/US Modernist Radio for all kinds of fun incentives to shamelessly empty your wallet. Today, US Modernist Radio welcomes architects Gene Kaufman of New York and Joe King of Sarasota, Florida, as we talk about Paul Rudolph's buildings around America. And now, the host that Richard Meyer wishes would wear white exclusively, George Smart and Frank King.
Hey, I'm George Smart. How are you? You are listening to US Modernist Radio. Frank and Tom, I am very pleased to announce that we now, after 8 shows, this is number 9, we have fan.
Well, really?
Yes, one fan letter came in, and it's from Consuelo Marshall of Raleigh. And here's what she wrote. I have been enjoying your podcast and listening to them on walks as I sweat in all this heat. So we have a sweaty fan. Just listened to number 6 with Crosby Doe and was very surprised to have him mention Eugene Loring. He was my ballet teacher in Hollywood when I was 4 or 5 years old. He must have lived close by our house in that tiny Neutra house. He made a huge impression on me and actually helped to shape my life into what it is today. What Crosby Doe did not mention is that Loring choreographed all the dances for the movies in the 1950s and beyond. So we really want to thank you, Consuelo.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And Consuelo, your name will now be entered in a fabulous prize drawing based on all the fan letters we have received to date. So, Tom, would you reach into the bin and pull out the winning name?
Hang on a second. Here.
Well, I can't believe it. It's Consuelo Marshall.
Oh, how about that?
The odds of that happening are just staggering. What's the math on that, Frank?
I think it's darn near 50-50.
Frank didn't pass the math class. Consuelo, you have won a year's membership in the North Carolina Modernist Houses Mod Squad, which gets you all kinds of exciting benefits. When you hear this on one of your sweaty walks, please just send me an email, and then maybe we'll have 2 fan letters.
Yay!
Nothing happens in podcast land without our incredible sponsors, Moho Realty and Modbox USA. When it's time to sell your modernist home, you should know Sarah Sonk of Moho Realty. Listing on MLS alone just isn't enough. Reach out to an agent who loves modernist houses with the expertise, experience, and track record to close your deal. She's Sarah Sonk, 919-601-7339. And by modboxusa.com. You'll want to turn your mailbox into a Modbox with one of Modbox USA's colorful, stylish, retro, mid-century modern mailboxes that complements your home's modern aesthetic and turns mail time into party time. See one now at modboxusa.com. And now here's Frank with the Modernist News.
Dateline, Williamstown, Kentucky, which is the site of the recreation of what some argue was the world's first piece of modernist architecture, Noah's Ark. The vessel, like many modernist home or commercial structure, is being built with a modernist technique called timber framing, which uses wood pegs and joints in lieu of nails. Amish carpenters all the way from Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania are doing the bulk of the timber work. Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and you think you have a rough commute. There is some dispute among architects as to it being a true modernist design, as the plans in the Bible call for but one window. However, boat builder turned architect Noah Goldstein, the 233rd, yes, Noah had a last name, it was Goldstein, points out that yes, it calls for but one window, but if you keep reading, the next sentence asks for that to be a floor-to-ceiling running the entire length of the ship window. Definitely modernist. The $29.5 million vessel, dubbed the Ark Encounter, which will be suspended along with disbelief 12 feet off the ground, will be the eventual centerpiece of a religious theme park. The ship will share the spotlight with the Creation Museum, which features Adam and Eve living in the Garden of Eden with dinosaurs. Apparently, these folks think the Flintstones was a documentary. Rihanna released a video. I can't use the first word, but Better Have My Money are the rest of the title. A 7-minute-long revenge fantasy in which she mutilates Hannibal actor Mad Mikkelsen from Hannibal. Wasn't canceling the guy's show punishment enough? In a beautiful mid-century modern house, thank you, which, by the way, reminds me of my grandma's house. Hers was not mid-century modern, but just like Rihanna's, all of the furniture in the living room was covered with plastic. The internet has found some solid clues indicating that Mads Mikkelsen here is a stand-in for Rihanna's former accountant that she accused of cheating her out of tons of money. The Rihanna persona gets its brutal revenge in the You Better Have My Money video, first kidnapping and torturing a woman on screen, and then tastefully cutting up the woman's husband off screen. It's the feel-good hit of the summer.
Tastefully, yes.
I know. Yes. The house was built in the late 40s and 50s for Chase Manhattan Bank heiress Dora Hutchinson and was rented for quite some time by Frank Sinatra, who supposedly rented out the guest house to Marilyn Monroe, who supposedly, that's a lot of supposedly, slept with JFK in there. If you're standing in the house looking at the rear yard, the Kennedy guest house is back and to the left. The house is up for sale, but according to Rihanna, it's not really to my taste. After watching the video, I'm not sure the words Rihanna and taste should belong in the same sentence. Finally, as the world's only certified modernist comedian, it's not too often that you run across a joke premise that involves architecture and an international drug cartel. Well, it happened this past weekend. Even by the standards of Mexico's drug cartels, the weekend prison break of Joaquin El Chapo, which means fire plug, Guzman, was a gutsy move. The Sinaloa cartel boss escaped from a maximum security prison via a 20 by 20 inch passage dug out of his shower and into a tunnel via a motorcycle that ended up in an under construction home in Santa Juanita, a city west of Mexico City. The design of many of the more elaborate tunnels, which some estimate cost upwards of $2 or $3 million, suggests professional involvement since they link up safe houses on the American side of the border with safe houses on the Mexican side of the border.
I'm shocked.
No, shocked, I tell you, shocked. According to the Wall Street Journal, authorities have suggested that these cartel infrastructure projects, the tunnels, drug tunnels, and the tunnel that he used to escape, have been designed and built by a small clique of architects and engineers from Durango, a mining area in northern Mexico, and that these employees, engineers and architects, are valued by the cartel and closely guarded by the cartel bosses. So far, only one of these architects has been arrested, Felipe de Jesus Corona Verbera, who started working with the cartel when El Chapo hired him to build a fake grocery store that served as a private zoo for El Chapo.
To fake a grocery store. I'm a melon.
Who happens to have a weapon.
Yeah, that's not as friendly as the greeters at Walmart. Anyway, after El Chapo's escape, and after they decided that his escape was facilitated, in fact, by an architect, the prison has a new theme song, and it goes like this: Mama don't allow no architects around here.
Oh, thank you, Frank.
And that's it.
CDs available in the lobby.
Yeah.
So let's get on to the show. In the zeitgeist of modernist architects that fans like us can generally name, there's Frank Lloyd Wright, Richard Neutra, Rudolf Schindler, and John Lautner, all of whom worked for or studied with Wright and ushered in modernist architecture in the 20th century. But other brilliant modernist designers carried the torch on their own. Paul Rudolph is not a starchitect like Wright, but he is well known for creating some of the most fascinating and creative modernist buildings in America. Rudolph rose to prominence as the leader of the Sarasota style of architecture, associated with architects like Ralph Twitchell, Ralph Zimmerman, Philip Hiss, Jack West, Gene Leedy, and others. Rudolph became dean of the Yale School of Architecture in 1958, shortly after designing their architecture building, considered his masterpiece. According to the 1997 obituary in the New York Times, with the exception of Louis Kahn, no American architect of his generation enjoyed higher esteem in the 1960s. People tend to either like a Paul Rudolph building or they hate it. His massive use of concrete made him the poster boy for brutalist architecture in public housing, urban renewal, and corporate headquarters. Many of his buildings now are being torn down or are in danger of being torn down. While inspiring a generation of architects, the public generally does not warm to his large brutalist designs, finding the intense use of concrete and steel to be oppressive. But today we welcome two passionate and willing to do something about it architects who fight for Rudolph's brilliant buildings from different parts of the country. Gene Kaufman is a well-known name in New York architecture. He is the $1 billion man of hotels, with total hotel construction value dominating virtually all other architects in the New York area. In addition, in recent years, he became a partner in the esteemed firm Gwathmey Siegel, now Gwathmey Siegel Kaufman. Today, Gene joins us about rescuing a building you can't check into for the night, the Goshen Orange County Government Complex designed by Rudolph. Welcome, Gene.
Thank you very much.
And we also have with us Joe King. Joe King is a Sarasota, Florida architect, builder, and author of the book Paul Rudolph, The Florida Houses, which is great. You can pick it up on Amazon. He is also a leading scholar of all post-war modernism in Florida and the go-to guy for Paul Rudolph in that state. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, George. Great to be here.
So, guys, let's start with the man himself, Paul Rudolph, who died in 1997. Did either of you get to know him in New York towards the end of his life? Gene, did you know him at all?
I met him only once, and I went in actually looking for a job, and I was a very young architect, walked in off the street, and it was a vast office, and there was one person sitting there, and towards the end of his career, he was greatly overlooked, and his former very large office, once full of people, he was actually a solitary practitioner, and of course he had no job to offer.
And so did you get to talk to him at all?
I spoke to him briefly, and I can't say I took away more than the feeling that he was a little bit bitter about the way things had changed over time for him. He was still the same person. He was still doing a great deal of interesting work, particularly in Asia, but had no commissions in the United States.
Now, Joe, Rudolph got his start, at least in terms of being well-known in the Sarasota area, and you've become quite an authority in both Rudolph and the Sarasota style. Tell us about the beginnings of that in the 40s and 50s in your area.
Probably the place to start is when Rudolph, in 1941, Rudolph came to work for architect Ralph Twitchell for about 6 months, and Rudolph had heard about Twitchell doing some interesting, what we ended up calling regional modernism, in the sense that there was the idea of adapting modern technologies and design concepts and so on to different regions, and then adapting it to the sort of subtropical west coast of Florida was a really interesting thing that grabbed the imagination of a lot of people around the World War II era. So Twitchell was becoming known. Rudolph had recently graduated from what's now Auburn University and came to work for Twitchell for a short time. And then World War II happened, and Rudolph went to school at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and then came back and was in partnership with Twitchell for several years. So that period in the 1940s was a time of really working through a lot of ideas of design and materials and sort of new ideas about sort of good living on the west coast of Florida in our climate.
And what was that good living like? Can you tell us a little bit about how these houses would appear, say, in contrast to sort of, say, traditional North Carolina cottages on the coast or things that you might see on Cape Cod?
Well, right. And Rudolph grew up in the American South and in Alabama mainly, and actually was very familiar with a lot of the sort of climatic climactic devices that we would have in the South to deal with heat and light and so on. But what Rudolph always did was he took a concept, sort of a familiar way of doing things, and worked hard to understand it, and then took it apart, would take it back down to its essences, and then make it new in some way. That's part of what was so interesting about these little tiny Florida houses. They were a lot of times little guest houses. There was physically not much to them, but they really had a lot of ideas, and much of it had to do with the flow of space, interior and exterior space. Rudolph and Twitchell really developed technologies for sliding glass doors, which here in Florida are, of course, everywhere and just sort of part of what we assume is always the case. But it was Twitchell and Rudolph and the craftsmen who worked for them who came up with systems for making transparent doors that would open up to connect the inside and the outside. So that's the kind of thing that they would do that would sort of reinvent ways of living.
Had air conditioning come along at this time?
No, this was all before air conditioning. So not only was it sort of an aesthetic sort of architectural thing, there really was an interest in survival and dealing with breezes, trying to make buildings sort of strong enough that hurricanes didn't affect them too much, building some out of concrete, slab-on-grade houses that are sort of cool underfoot, and also that resist termites, things like that. A lot of interest in low maintenance construction.
And what was Sarasota and the outlying barrier islands like population-wise at the time? Because we tend to think of that part of the country as fairly highly populated. Was it still more sparse then? Very small towns, rural. But Sarasota had a real presence and real ambitions for, I guess the big time. And Sarasota, more than many cities in Bradenton, attracted all sorts of folks. Of course, the Ringling Brothers Circus brought all kind of people there. There were a lot of sort of society folks who would come to Sarasota for the winter, and so there was always a cultural sort of aspect. A lot of writers lived in Sarasota, both seasonally and full time. So it made for a sort of a cultural dynamic that, in a lot of ways, at that time was sort of ideal for this small scale experimental architecture. That people would let this young Rudolph fellow design them a guest house like no other guest house that had been designed before. And there was a little bit of an adventurous spirit going on in that sense. Now, we have all these houses documented on the website. People can go online and look them up. At the time, I noticed that in documenting these houses that the owners would tend to stay there for a long time. I mean, it's much more so than the usual turnover of a house. Is it fair to say that people really prized these houses?
Well, I think so. They were designed, specifically for these clients and the way they lived, and it was a big commitment of sort of ideas and ways of living. And often, if something works, well, why change it? So a lot of those houses were owned by the same people for a long, long time.
After Rudolph left Florida to go to New York, he embarked on a new kind of direction, working on government buildings, working on commercial buildings, working on public housing, working on urban renewal projects in the 50s and 60s. In the North Carolina area, he was most famous for the Burroughs Welcome Complex, some of which has been saved as part of a new campus renovation at the site and is going to be around for a long time. Gene, when Rudolph came to New York, how did his career take off from there?
Well, he became the dean at Yale in 1958, and that was a very influential position, not only in academia, but he got attention as an architect, and he got a lot of commissions, most notably the architecture school at Yale, although it included many other projects he did at other universities and other government buildings. And he became a major name and a go-to architect in a relatively short period of time.
If you saw a Paul Rudolph building, what would be some of the common characteristics?
Well, notably, many and most of the buildings in the Northeast were done in poured-in-place concrete, and the concrete's left exposed. The brutalist label sometimes lends a negative feeling to it, but in fact, he thought concrete was beautiful. And in fact, the concrete was quite beautiful, and he worked with a variety of techniques and with a variety of geometries, and you had blocks which he would make with a ribbed pattern. He had curves. He had a very sculptural kind of quality with concrete. Concrete, of course, forms to any shape. So he really was like a sculptor on an architectural scale, and the buildings still read like that today, like giant sculptures.
Are there any particular buildings in your area or perhaps in that part of the country that people might have gone by or know about?
Well, certainly the building at Yale is the one that's gotten a lot of attention. There's several other buildings in New Haven. There's also a major government center in Boston. And in New York City, there are a couple of buildings, including some residential, and notably his own house, which is on Sutton Place, where he basically put a very modern building with a great deal of glass on top of a 19th century row house. And so his buildings are in a number of places. They're not necessarily in the most prominent of places, so I think people tend to seek them out. But they're there, and there are many of them.
If you look on the website, you'll see some of these houses were really way out there as far as the design of the day. You've got not just the use of organic kind of curves, but you've got these really big angles. You've got all kinds of materials being put in places. And sometimes there's one house I saw, I think it's in Pennsylvania. It looks like a giant solar array.
Well, I think Rudolph was always searching for new ways of doing things that had been done before in a conventional way. And remarkably, he succeeded a great deal in doing that. And to the extent that these houses still seem unique, I think is a tribute to how unusual his approach was and actually to his success in being able to do that.
Now, Rudolph, I think in the late 50s and towards the early 60s, approached his zenith of popularity and got called in to do a number of public housing and urban renewal projects. Do you know anything about those?
Well, he also had the idea that architecture was for everybody and was not an elitist, and he started with homes for people who aren't necessarily very wealthy, as we just heard. And he moved on to doing housing, including he worked on a prefabricated housing project for a long period of time. The idea, of course, tied into the economics of trying to make this available and affordable. But many of his commissions ended up veering into sort of major institutional buildings. And so today, that's what we tend to remember, and the other ones are not as mentioned as often.
But towards the end of his life, he was a rock star in Singapore, right?
Well, interestingly, his reputation went down towards the end of the 60s, and famously, the architecture students at Yale, who were the people using his building at Yale, attempted to burn it down. And with that and with changes in the timing, all of a sudden, Rudolph sort of fell from grace in the United States. But shortly thereafter, or even overlapping, he became a rock star in Asia. And so if you went to a place like Hong Kong and you stood there and you looked up, you saw one very unusual building. Of course, there are others now, but he created a building in the harbor in Hong Kong that nobody had ever seen anything like it. And he did similar things in Jakarta, Singapore, and other cities around Asia. And rockstar, I think, is an appropriate analogy.
There's one building in particular we want to talk about today, and that's the Orange County Government Complex, Goshen, New York. In August of 2010, the county executive decided, why don't we just tear this thing down and build a new one? and it'll only cost us $114 million. And from there, there's a complicated timeline of events and back and forth involving the legislature, involving Hurricane Irene, which inundated the building and caused a flood and a lot of damage. The taxpayers of Orange County, the Democratic Alliance, a new county executive, various architecture firms take us all the way to where destruction of this very nice building and a very serviceable and restorable building is imminent. Then enters Gene Kaufman with a rescue plan. And what was it, Gene?
My plan was to buy the building from the county because they didn't want it. They didn't want the responsibility of repairing it. They didn't want to be in it. And my idea was to make it a private development and to convert the building to artists' live-work studios. And then the idea was to build a new government building because there's a 24-acre site with most of it wide open space. And so the county would get a new government building, but the Rudolph building would be kept fully intact and given a new use.
And so would this building, would that be your building or the county's building, or how would that work?
My proposal was to buy it.
Mm-hmm.
I offered them $5 million in cash, and I was going to pay all the costs, raise all of the money, and own the building. And I'm not sure I would have made any money doing this, but my feeling was that we would certainly be able to cover our costs, perhaps make some income, and it would be completely a private venture, and it would generate a great deal of economic activity, provide a place for people who would appreciate the building, who would live and work there, and at the same time, the county would also get a government building, which would be theirs. And interestingly enough, all of this ended up coming in for less money than what they originally intended to spend.
Yeah, significantly, I understand.
Well, I think that the approach they had was wasteful in a number of ways. I mean, interestingly, Rudolph's building included a great deal of common and circulation space that was, let's say, over and above a basic kind of program. So there was a lot of effort and expense that had to go into that. And since they were given the opportunity to think of what they might want, they came up with a whole lot of things that they probably didn't need, but which bloated the program. And so, in fact, their idea eventually ended up expanding the building by some enormous amount, even though it appears that government services have contracted and could fit into less space.
So how far along did your proposal get? Because I know that in October of last year, some of the lawmakers were actually quite warm to this idea of selling the building. Well,
I think that the political situation ended up trumping the architectural one, but there was a big division between people who wanted to save the building and people who wanted to keep it, both for architectural purposes and in economic terms. And the county leadership had consistently said for a number of years that they wanted to demolish it, and it was not for cost savings because their plan was more expensive, but they just wanted a traditional look. Their initial idea to replace this building looked like a 19th century New England town hall or even a church. And I think that their idea was to basically wipe out history and as well as to wipe out the architecture. And unfortunately, they never really wavered from that. And we were able to forestall all of the demolition for quite a long period of time. But now, unfortunately and tragically, it appears they will be proceeding with the demolition of the building.
Yeah, I see in news reports that that's happening as we speak.
They started emptying out the interior of the building. That's correct. First they did some removals, and now they're actually starting some interior demolition. Arguably, the interior demolition, some of it would have to happen anyway through minor elements, but they've already let out the contract for the demolition of the building, except for the concrete frame in a couple of areas.
So how tough is it to destroy a Rudolph building? Do you have to have special bulldozers? I mean, or do you have to have extra crews? I mean, it would seem like it would be tough.
Well, we could say it was built like a brick, but it was a concrete a poured-in-place building, and it's quite difficult to take down. And in fact, their own estimate of taking down this building was $3.5 million, which is a huge number, much more than you would expect for a building this size. But the bids came in double that number, more than $7 million, and that's what they've contracted to do. So the destruction of this building is a $7 million cost, plus any overruns.
Now, what about the lawsuits? There have been at least one, and I hear that there's another.
There are various community and citizen groups have tried to stop this because it's certainly foolhardy and it's a waste of taxpayer money. And a number of government procedures that are required had not been followed in the proper way. Unfortunately, the people in the government who did want to remove this building used the time frame when the lawsuits were filed to go back and revise some of the steps that they had taken so that they could be in narrow compliance. And so far, no judge has intervened. Perhaps there's another reason why, because the courts are expected to reoccupy a portion of this building, and I think that they've been reluctant to vote to change the plan since they're the intended beneficiaries, and I might say without any payment. They don't have to pay rent, but they do get the space.
So what is this stubbornness going to cost that government? How much is the tab going to be the taxpayers by the time this is all over?
Well, they're spending north of $70 million, and most likely a lot more if the demolition came in at double. I think what we'll find is that the bids for the project they have in mind will also come in very high. Our idea was to buy the building from them, and we demonstrated and drew plans for a building that they could build that met their entire program of what they wanted for $50 million. So it's been a great deal of extra cost, $27 million actually of extra cost.
And that doesn't even count what the overruns are expected to be, right?
Correct.
The Paul Rudolph Heritage Foundation, run by Rudolph's partner Ernst Wagner, recently launched a lawsuit to save this building, which is an 11th hour attempt. What are the odds of that making any difference, or have the county officials got this locked up?
Well, unfortunately, the odds are long. The odds were long when I went there a year ago and offered to buy the building and to try to change what they were doing. From a common sense point of view, the odds seem pretty good because common sense says that even if you don't love this building, it makes sense to save it. And, of course, a great deal of people do love it. But on all practical aspects, it would make sense for them to change plans, except they have refused to do so.
There is a link on the website where if you want to support the Paul Rudolph Heritage Foundation or sign a petition to see about saving the building, you can do that online. Joe, down in Florida, you don't have these larger buildings by Rudolph, right?
Well, we've had a couple, the Riverview High School in Sarasota, and then Rudolph's addition to Sarasota High School. Or two large public buildings that are fairly well known, I think.
And how are they doing?
Well, interesting stories on those two. The school board decided that Riverview High School some years ago was in poor condition and sort of beyond repair. So they, after much protest and much work from a number of architects and preservationists and all sorts of people, that the school board ended up demolishing that one, which was really too bad because it was a really wonderful building. But on the other hand, Sarasota High School, the Rudolph's addition to Sarasota High School that was done just about the time that he moved north and started at Yale, has been rehabilitated. And is looking better now than it has in decades, and it's a really wonderful thing. So that's good.
And what's coming up for you? Is there a conference about Sarasota Modern this fall?
There is the Sarasota Architectural Foundation, which has become a very very active organization in the last several years. Has started a yearly program that they call Sarasota Mod, And the first year was last year, and then this year it will happen, I think, November 6th through 8th. I think that's right. And the focus this year is all about Paul Rudolph. So there's a lot of excitement on that.
Cool.
Gene?
Yes.
Frank King here. I've spent a good deal of my adult life in hotels and motels, and I know you are the king of New York hotels. There's something that's fascinated and frustrated me, and it's that most of the hotels have an air conditioning heating unit under the window with the vents pointed up, and then whoever designs the interior of the room always seems to hang curtains over the window space so that when you turn on the unit, the heat and the air conditioning blows directly up inside the curtains and not around the room. And I've thought to myself, is it because the people who designed the interior of a hotel have never stayed in a hotel and don't understand how air moving upward would fill the curtains and not fill the room? But to me, it seems simple. Let's use blinds, but, maybe I'm missing something. Do you feel my pain?
Well, you have a very good point. It's something that should be solved very easily and frequently is not. But interestingly, those air conditioning units under the window are happening less and less, and more we're putting those units on the interior and above the bathroom or above the entryway. And so that will be solving your problem as we do more and more hotels.
Yes! Thank you very much. You've made my day. Now, second question for Gene. Have you ever tried your hand at designing houses?
I've done a few. Interestingly, that's supposed to be the training ground for architects. And after doing two, somehow or other, I jumped on to the next thing and never went back. But I'm doing one now in Connecticut all these years later.
Is it a modern house, Gene?
It is. And I think that it's a good example of how it's possible to do a great piece of modern work, even in a community where this house is, where there are a lot of traditional houses. And I think going back to Rudolph, one of the great strengths of his buildings were the way they contrasted with other things. And I think ultimately made both things stronger. It's been said that his building in Orange County, which is 300,000 people living there in many buildings, is the best building of all of Orange County, but it's the one they chose to destroy.
So the neighbors of your house in Connecticut didn't come out with pitchforks when they heard about this?
At least not so far. You'll have to stay tuned.
Okay, good. So, Joe, two houses I want to talk to you about, Joe. Number one, the Twitchell home on Siesta Key that you own and tried to restore. I want to hear a little bit more about that. And secondly, I'd like to hear about your recreating Rudolph's Walker Guest House.
Okay, sure. 10 years ago, I bought the property that had the original Ralph Twitchell house, 1941 Twitchell house, that was the first project that Paul Rudolph worked on when he came to work for Twitchell. And that was Twitchell's own house. After living many years in Sarasota, Twitchell was finally able to design and build his own house, and Rudolph learned a great deal from Twitchell at that time. Speaking of Frank Lloyd Wright, as we did at the very beginning, there was a lot of sort of Wrightian influence in that house. But that, as we also noted earlier, that house, as many of them, don't change hands very often. But that one came up for sale. And it was in terrible condition, but I was, 10 years younger and optimistic and ambitious.
Young and foolish.
And architecturally foolish, probably. So I figured that I could buy it and restore it. And there were some interesting things going for that. But it ended up being really, really in bad condition. There was maybe I was too ambitious. There had been a flood during a storm, and then the house had caught fire during the flood. So the house hadn't really burned down because it was raining so hard. But there were all sorts of things that were an issue, and it was 25 feet back from the edge of the Gulf of Mexico. at an elevation of 5.5 feet above sea level. In fact, if we had built a code-compliant addition, which I had an idea to do behind the landward of the existing house, the floor of the code-compliant house would have been at the roof level of the Twitchell house. So from the code-compliant addition, you could have just looked out over the Twitchell house out to the Gulf. But it ended up being a real mess. And what I decided to do is take it apart. Of course, we documented everything, and I've taken it apart, and I have all the roof framing and Ocala block and all those sorts of things stored away, so that one day my idea is to rebuild it, or rebuild at least the living room, which is the main sort of key element of the house, on higher ground. So I think that would be a good idea.
It's a giant Lego set now? You just unbox it and put it together?
Well, it's a little complicated, but we have the parts. So I mentioned the Sarasota Architectural Foundation, and they have got a series of good ideas too, and they felt like they could probably ask me because I would be interested in doing such a project. Because
you're young and foolish.
They had the idea of rebuilding the Walker Guest House. The Walker Guest House is a very important project of Rudolph's. It was built in 1952 down on Sanibel Island. It still exists. Of course, it's an old building, but it's still there. But the Architectural Foundation had the idea of building this thing fresh, new, from new materials, from Rudolph's drawings, and building it as an exhibit, so that people could walk through it, so they could see it. This is the building that has a series of flaps hinged at the top of these large panels, and a series of counterweights and pulleys, all kind of things. And so we're in the middle right now of building this thing. What we're doing is we're sort of pre-building it. And speaking of kit parts, and then we're gonna take it apart and then put it back together in the next few months on the grounds of the Ringling Museum in Sarasota, where it will open at the beginning of November in time for that Sarasota Mod weekend.
When you ship it around to different museums later on tour, is assembly required, or does it come on like a big enough truck?
Some assembly is required. That's right. There's a lot of tab A's and slot B's that have to be put together on this thing. We actually debated whether to make the building where it could go on a truck all in one piece, but it's a little bit too wide for that. And the truth is that the structure is so minimal. This is in contrast to the massive concrete buildings, that it's mostly space. It's mostly space. The structure is very, very, very modest, very thin. So what we figured we could do is develop some systems where we could take it apart and pack it on pallets and then put it back together at different locations.
Joe, that is actually a fantasy of mine. I've always wanted to own a mobile home because I've always wanted to be able to yell to my wife, "Honey, honey, the house is here." It sounds like with your tab A into slot B, that's here's my question though. If I am in Florida and I've got a modernist home and I spot you in my driveway with a crowbar and a Phillips screwdriver, should I be very, very afraid?
Oh, that's right. You should be. You should be. I'll take it apart.
There was a house here yesterday. What the?
Well, thank you both, Gene and Joe, for being on the show. It's been great to have you. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having us.
US Modernist Radio is underwritten by Sarah Sonk, the real estate agent who loves modernist houses just as much as you do. 919-601-7339. And by modboxusa.com and their swanky, colorful, stylish, retro, mid-century modern mailboxes. Thanks for listening. Take us out, Tom.
Visit US Modernist Radio on the web at usmodernistradio.org for links about people and buildings mentioned today on the show. US Modernist Radio is recorded at Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Meanwhile, follow us on Twitter at US Modernist or email us at comments@usmodernistradio.org. US Modernist Radio is a production of North Carolina Modernist Houses, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and Frank and I will be back in 2 weeks for another cantilevered, floor-to-ceiling, less is more concrete and steel edition of US Modernist Radio.